Well, hello there. You're watching the press preview. A first look then at what is on the front pages as they arrive. Time then to see what is making the headlines with the journalist and broadcaster Jenny Kleeman and Madeline Grant, assistant comment editor at the Daily Telegraph, with us from now until just before midnight. So welcome to you on what has been certainly a very busy evening. Before we hear from you, let's look at the front pages, starting with the Telegraph, which says that Boris Johnson's premiership is hanging on by a thread after the Health Secretary and then the Chancellor resigned in quick succession earlier. Similarly, The Guardian says the PM is on the brink. As does the Financial Times. Johnson on the brink as ministers quit, their headline. As the Metro points out, Boris Johnson is still clinging onto power despite those heavy blows, with a timeline of what happened earlier. End games, writes The Eye. It's last chance saloon for the Sun, while it's curtains for Bozo, according to The Star. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch our guest this evening. So let's go to Jenny and Madeline with reaction, first of all, to quite an evening. Madeline, you start. I mean, the theme in the papers, on the brink, you know, last chance saloon. How do you see this shaping out?
Well, I mean, it turns out there's many different ways to skin a cat, and there's many different ways to say that today has been a very disastrous day for the Prime Minister. It's arguably the most perilous day of his entire premiership. And the PM is therefore in his gravest danger so far. I mean, it's kind of, this word gets used far too much in politics these days, but it feels like doubly unprecedented territory, because under normal circumstances, no conventional prime minister would be able to survive resignations of this magnitude, losing the second most powerful person in your cabinet and another high-ranking minister. Mrs. Thatcher couldn't survive it. Theresa May resigned voluntarily before she was actually shoved out in probably less serious circumstances. But of course, in Boris Johnson, we are not dealing with a conventional prime minister. And we know that based on every indicator that we've had tonight and everything that we know about him up till now, that he will try to cling on for as long as humanly possible. He will have to be prized out of number 10, kicking and screaming. And as we've seen, and as we will discuss, he is already moving very quickly to try and fill the vacancies in his cabinet. So really, the big takeaway for me is that Boris Johnson is going nowhere unless his MPs can force him out.
Yes, and I just want to dwell on the Telegraph. They point out that Mr Javid announced his resignation on Twitter at 6:02 p.m, while Mr Sunak tweeted his letter at 6:11 p.m, and aides to both men, Jenny, insisted that they did not coordinate their resignations. But then they say that Boris Johnson met a group of about 80 Tory MPs in a pre-arranged meeting today, moments after those resignations. He made clear that he would carry on, and also indicated that tax cuts would be easier to deliver after the developments in a swipe at Mr Sunak. So just your reflections on the fact that these two specifically have gone, who's replacing them, and whether it's enough to keep Boris Johnson in post.
What's interesting about the resignation letters is they're quite different. They share certain factors, like they both seem to be calling on Boris Johnson to do the right thing and calling into question his character, his suitability to lead. But Rishi Sunak was certainly suggesting in his resignation letter that Boris Johnson was sugarcoating things and not being straight with the British public, which Rishi Sunak wanted to do. So the suggestion being that there was this undercurrent of tax cuts at the bottom of all of this, and presumably Nadhim Zahawi, the new Chancellor, will be more disposed to be behind them. Boris Johnson is the optimist. He wants to give good news. But, you know, let's put all of this in context. The Prime Minister has not just lost the confidence of 75% of his backbenchers. He has now had 3 cabinet resignations with Oliver Dowden added into the mix as well. We've also had 7 resignations of people in junior posts, PPSs, trade envoys. People are falling like dominoes. as Madeline said, this has not been survivable by any other Prime Minister. I can't think of another time where the Chancellor and the Health Secretary have resigned on the same day. The Health Secretary during a COVID spike, the Chancellor during a cost of living crisis. And yet the normal rules do not apply to Boris Johnson. He is the kind of embodiment of privilege and entitlement. And he seems to think that if he can continue this cycle of scandal, lies, denial, and then apology, that he will somehow get away with it. But I think there is a feeling now that this is the straw that is breaking the camel's back, that this particular, who would have thought, Pincher, nobody would have really known his name a week ago. But there is just only so much of this corrosive drip of dishonour that people can take. And it seems that this is the corrosive drip that has kind of burned the critical hole in his prime ministership.
Well, The Guardian has chosen to quote from the resignation letter, Madeline, of Sajid Javid, saying, "We may not have always been popular, but we have been competent in acting in the national interest. Sadly, in the current circumstances, the public are concluding that we are now neither." And the criticism seems to be levelled at Boris Johnson, that he's running a populist government that is neither popular or competent. Is that a fair charge?
I think it's a very fair charge. I mean, for some time now, the Conservative Party has been keeping us in a kind of bizarre state where normal governance cannot take place because it seems that all of the firepower of Number 10 is devoted towards dealing with whatever the latest crisis is. And in fact, there have been so many of them that, as Jenny says, it feels almost arbitrary that Chris Pincher should be the one to tip things over into this level, because there has just been, almost a weekly or bi-weekly crisis of this magnitude. And that means that Number 10 is spending all its time fighting fires and not getting on with the business of governing the country. But B, it gradually erodes at the public's trust and any kind of confidence that they might have had in that government. So you can make your policy proposals until the cows come home. But I think we've kind of reached a saturation point now where whatever is said by Number 10, people would say, well, this doesn't feel credible. These are just words, that how do I know that this might be implemented? So we've almost got into a kind of post-governance state of politics, which is seriously untenable. And it just so happens that the Chris Pincher allegations are the ones that have cascaded into something that could no longer be avoided by those two in the cabinet.
Well, the Metro, Jenny, with their headline, going, gone. Gone has a question mark on it because clearly they point out that the PM is still clinging on to power. Chris Pincher, Partygate, those are the elements of all of this in his control. But should there be some sympathy in this firefighting government, which has had to deal with a pandemic and now an energy crisis and a cost of living crisis and an inflation crisis? These are global events which have rocked this government, and they're dealing with it as best they can, if we're to use a sympathetic slant on them. Not all of these crises, this series of crises, are in their control.
There is a very serious set of problems facing every country in the world here. We are all recovering from the pandemic, if not already, still in it. We're in the middle of a COVID spike, as I said, at the moment, a cost of living crisis, inflation everywhere, which is why it is such a disgrace that we in this country are having to deal with the indignities that Boris Johnson is heaping on this country. We are a laughing stock internationally because we are having to deal on a day-to-day basis with this ridiculous cycle of different lies, different denials. You have cabinet ministers, government ministers every morning going on the rounds, talking to journalists on breakfast TV and on the radio, having to defend not policies, but lines that are shown to be lies by the government. Any fault of the government, any crisis that the government is facing is completely of Boris Johnson's own making. And yes, there are giant global events, but that's not, nobody's complaining about those today. What we're complaining about is the complete distraction that Boris Johnson has become of the work of governing this country at a time when we are crying out for ideas, we are crying out for leadership, and what we get is sleaze and lies upon lies and apologies and an assumption that we, the British public, will somehow just forget about this. In a few days' time, we'll forget about this, that he can sort of gaslight us and we'll move on. But I think, we've reached a kind of critical mass now where we can't take it anymore and his cabinets can't take it anymore.
Well, The Sun, their headline with a picture of Boris Johnson with his back to us, suggesting he's in his last chance saloon. At least they're suggesting he's got a last chance, because the mood music after those 2 resignations, Madeline, was that he was a goner already. He's clearly trying to stay in post. But what does he need to do now, do you think, to put some of this behind him? Because obviously Wednesday he has PMQs, he's got the liaison committee with some no doubt very challenging questions put to him in both of those. So what needs to happen for Conservative MPs and grassroots to be satisfied?
I'm not sure there is anything that could happen that would satisfy both of those groups. But, you know, in the long term, I don't really think that Boris Johnson's team and Boris Johnson himself really think much about the long term. I think they're more interested in, you know, the hand-to-mouth survival, what happens next week. I think that their aim right now will be limping on until we get to the summer recess in a couple of weeks, and then hoping that over the summer things calm down a bit. Maybe there will be they'll make some more policy announcements in the hope of just diverting attention away from the dysfunctionality in number 10. I don't think that will be successful at this point. I just really cannot fathom anything that might secure his position in the long term. But in the short term, I guess we're seeing some of it already tonight, appointing some people to replace those cabinet resignations, appointing Nadhim Zahawi, who's very highly regarded within the party, and Steve Barclay, who's considered to be, I think, a safe pair of hands. These are kind of quite, I suppose it was the fact that he was able to get Nadhim Zahawi around to be in his cabinet, that would be seen as quite a coup for him. But as I say, I think in the long term, that particular die is cast. I don't really see how the Prime Minister would be able to turn things around. At the very least, I think that he would not be able to turn it around with the electorate in a future election if there were to be one.
And I suppose if we look back at the at one point they were talking about Boris Johnson, Jenny, having multiple terms in office. I suppose the rot set in with the defence of the former MP Owen Paterson, which led to questions about MPs' second jobs. That was followed by those Partygate revelations from December onwards. But the drip that Tory MPs have had to listen to about Boris Johnson, what we need to know now, I suppose, is how many have been tipped over the edge, the former supporters of them. Certainly Andrew Bridgen, a vocal critic, said today that he reckoned they could easily have 180 letters to Sir Graham Brady, the chair of the 1922 committee, and whether it is at that moment, the tipping point of letters, that could force him still out of office.
Yes, I mean, the backbenchers are thinking about their constituents, they're thinking about their jobs, they're thinking about whether or not they could win their seats again at the next election. And when you're talking about things like the Owen Paterson affair, which sounds like corruption, or when you're talking about Partygate, which sounds like one rule for them and another rule for us, which I think still really stings a lot of people. We all know what we were doing during those lockdowns, and the vast majority of us were not having parties. These are things that voters don't forget. And I think Boris Johnson thought he had got away with it because of the way that the 1922 committee works, but there are going to be elections in the 1922 committee. The rebels are trying to get representation on the executive so that the rules can be changed and so that there can be another vote of no confidence. Imagine if that vote was taking place now, and imagine those people who voted that they did have confidence only a few weeks ago. How many of them would be voting in the same way today?
Well, I wondered when I arrived here today whether we'd see the bags being packed in number 11 Downing Street as Rishi Sunak leaves, but then people reminded me that he'd actually gone in about April after all those revelations about the financial dealings of his wife and his green card and so on. There is number 11. It's lit up, as you can see. No doubt the work is still going on. There are still offices, as we've heard many a time, in Downing Street. And Nadhim Zahawi will move in eventually, one presumes. We've got the Times in as well. Actually, Madeline, Johnson on the brink. We'll certainly discuss that and the incomers in those 2 crucial posts in cabinet after this break. Well, welcome back. You're watching the press preview. With me now, once again, the journalist and broadcaster Jenny Kleeman and Madeline Grant, assistant comment editor at the Daily Telegraph. Welcome back to both of you. Let's go to the Times then. Once again, the word brink being used for this paper. Picture of Boris Johnson on the front cover as well. And I have to say, they have written their view as a leader column as well, Jenny. The Times view on Boris Johnson's position: game over, they say. The Prime Minister has lost the confidence of his party and the country. He should quit now, if the Conservatives are to have any chance of winning the next general election. And we remember that the Conservative Party, it's tough on its leaders. It knows when it wants them to go. And it's all about winning seats for parliamentarians and winning power for the Conservatives.
The wording of this leader is incredibly strong, this Times leader. It says, serial dishonesty has corrosive effect on effective government and also on our country. And this is it. It's about our reputation as well. And here you have somebody who is abjectly clinging on to power, even though it is not in the interests of his party, of government, or of this country. And, the front page story of the Times has an extraordinary quote from Boris Johnson. When it was suggested to him this evening that he might go, he apparently said, "F that." What kind of person looks at this mutiny of those closest to him? These are people with experience and knowledge. And bearing in mind that Boris Johnson doesn't necessarily value experience and knowledge. He values loyalty, and his cabinet is largely comprised of biddable people that he has amassed around him because he knows they'll support him. But what kind of person looks at this scenario and thinks, you know what would be best for the country if I don't change anything that I'm doing? It's absolutely extraordinary. And for the Times to be saying this is really quite significant because, this is a newspaper that has supported Boris Johnson in the past and even quite recently. So this is a very significant turning point, I'd say.
Well, you think the Times leader article is bad. Jenny, we've just had the Daily Mail in. We'll show you it in a minute. I'm not sure we've quite got the image of it. But I'll read you the headline. Can even Boris, the greased piglet, wriggle out of this, suggesting it was the most tumultuous night, the most dramatic night in Westminster since the toppling of Margaret Thatcher. We remember this for general elections, don't we? Just before the vote, the newspapers come down on what they think should happen, who people should vote for. Here we're starting to see the newspapers with their view on what this Prime Minister should do. And the question, I suppose, is how influential still are the newspapers when they make their mark and their comment like this, Madeline?
I don't think they're particularly influential. I think newspapers tend to, I don't think they shape opinion so much as they reflect the opinion of their readers, and they play to their audience, which is perhaps a slightly controversial view of newspapers, given that I work for one. But I think that on the whole, the influence of the newspapers is nothing close to where it used to be in previous decades when far more people read a paper every day. But no, I think that what we're seeing here is newspapers like to back a winner on the whole. And it's clear that many newspapers, as well as what the views of the editorial section feel about the Prime Minister and his faults. I also think that newspapers like to be anticipating the mood of their readers and of the country, and I suppose being ahead of the game and to back a winner, that tends to be quite important for newspapers. So I think in that sense it shows that the tide is turning from people who watch Westminster very carefully and are now seeing that
just hearing there's been another
turning away
resignation.
from the Prime.
Madeline, apologies. I'm just going to butt in. Alex Chalk, Solicitor General, has resigned to add to that list. So one more. We thought perhaps it was over for tonight, but it seems not.